Welcome to Revolution Chronicles, where the forgotten pages of history come alive. Today, we uncover the haunting tale of those who brought death to the innocent, and the justice that finally found them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories from America's past and beyond. Asterisk. The year was closing in on the final chapter of war. Across broken towns and burned-out villages, the echoes of gunfire had faded, but the silence that followed was heavier than the smoke that lingered in the air. Streets once filled with laughter now lay empty, littered with the ashes of homes and the ghosts of families who never came back. For years, the invaders ruled through fear. They came not as liberators, but as executioners dressed in uniforms, men who believed their orders placed them above mercy. Civilians were punished for crimes they never committed. A whisper of defiance was enough to bring soldiers to the door, and entire families vanished overnight. The countryside became a graveyard without markers, where every tree seemed to hide a story of loss. But history has a way of turning. Even as darkness seemed endless, resistance began to flicker, quietly, stubbornly. In barns, basements, and broken churches, brave men and women whispered plans of rebellion. They carried old rifles, hidden under straw or beneath coats. They weren't soldiers. They were farmers, teachers, mothers, and sons, people who refused to kneel any longer. And as the tide of war shifted, the power of fear began to crumble. The same invaders who once barked orders and terrorized villagers started to retreat, their confidence cracking under the weight of their own crimes. Rumors spread fast. The Allied forces were advancing, and justice was coming with them. When liberation finally arrived, it didn't come with celebration. It came with silence. The survivors were too broken to cheer. They wandered through ruins, searching for names among the dead. And when they found the men responsible, the commanders who had signed the orders, the officers who had laughed as homes burned, there was no trial by rumor, no wild revenge. There was something far more deliberate: justice. Across Europe, and in corners of the world still scarred by war, the hunt for war criminals began. The photographs that surfaced, officers standing against cracked walls, faces pale, hands tied, became the final portraits of men who once thought they'd never be judged. This story isn't just about punishment. It's about the weight of truth, about what happens when the innocent finally speak, and the guilty can no longer hide behind their uniforms. What follows is a tale of vengeance not driven by rage, but by remembrance. A story that reminds us that justice, though slow, never forgets the names of the innocent, or those who took them away. Asterisk. The first reports came in whispers. A mother who'd lost her son. A farmer who'd watched his neighbors taken at dawn. A teacher who saw soldiers drag her students away, never to return. At first, no one believed it could be so cruel, that entire villages could be erased because one man dared to resist. But soon, disbelief turned to horror. What began as isolated rumors became a pattern of brutality stretching across the land. The invaders called it pacification. To them, it was policy, a cold, systematic punishment for anyone suspected of defiance. To the people, it was terror. On a gray morning, long before sunrise, trucks would rumble down the dirt roads. Their engines echoed across the hills like a warning bell. The villagers knew what that sound meant. Doors were slammed shut, candles snuffed out. Mothers clutched their children, praying the soldiers would pass by. But they rarely did. The soldiers went door to door, their boots pounding on wooden floors. Lists were read, names called out. No explanations, no arguments. The accused, and often those who had done nothing at all, were dragged into the cold. The rest were locked inside their homes, windows nailed shut. Then came the flames. Within minutes, entire streets were burning. The smell of smoke mixed with cries of the living and the silence of the dead. Chickens, dogs, cattle, all turned loose in panic, running through the fire-lit chaos. In some towns, the church bell rang once before it melted in the heat. Those who survived called it a nightmare that refused to end. One survivor, an old man years later, said, "You couldn't tell where one cry ended and the next began. It was as if the earth itself was screaming." The invaders left behind more than ruins. They left behind fear, a silence so deep that even decades later, survivors spoke in whispers when remembering those nights. Graves were dug quickly, often shallow, because the soldiers would not allow time for mourning. In some cases, the victims were forced to dig their own graves. For the officers, it was just another assignment. Reports filed, numbers counted, orders carried out. But in those reports, in the neat handwriting of men who thought they were untouchable, lay the evidence of genocide. The number of civilians killed was marked as if it were inventory. Every bullet had a record, every burning house a signature. Still, there were acts of courage amid the horror. In a small town's outskirts, a priest refused to abandon his parishioners. When soldiers came for the villagers, he stepped forward, holding his cross high, refusing to move. They shot him first. His body lay at the foot of the church, and even the soldiers hesitated before setting the building on fire. In another village, a mother hid 3 children beneath floorboards as the soldiers stormed through. She told them not to breathe, not to cry, no matter what happened. They heard the shouting, the gunfire, and the sound of boots leaving. When the silence finally came, she was gone, but the children lived. They would tell her story half a century later, their voices trembling as they remembered her final words. "Stay quiet. You must live." The destruction wasn't random. It was meant to break the will of the people. The invaders believed that if enough innocents died, others would surrender. But it had the opposite effect. Each atrocity fueled the resistance. Each fallen family became a reason to fight harder. When the smoke cleared, the survivors began writing names on scraps of paper, old wood, or stones, anything they could find. They buried their loved ones where they fell. Years later, these makeshift graves would become silent monuments to lives stolen in the dark. As liberation grew closer, investigators began documenting the atrocities. What they found shocked even hardened soldiers. In basements, they discovered burned documents, blood-stained walls, and photographs the invaders had taken, trophies of their cruelty. Some of those photos still exist. Rows of civilians before firing squads, faces frozen in disbelief. The records revealed how far the cruelty reached. These were not isolated acts of war. They were deliberate crimes, executed with military precision. The same names appeared again and again on orders, the same officers, the same signatures. The men who had led these massacres were not ghosts. They had ranks, medals, families of their own, and now, for the first time, their actions were being written down not as victories, but as crimes against humanity. The world had not yet seen justice, but something had shifted. The survivors, once too afraid to speak, began to tell their stories. One by one, their testimonies formed a chain stronger than any weapon. "They thought we were too broken to remember," said one woman decades later. "But we did. Every name, every face, every night they came." And so the record grew, pages of pain and courage written by the hands of those who refused to let the truth die. The invaders who once felt untouchable were now being hunted, not by armies, but by memory itself. The question was no longer if they would be caught. It was when by the winter of the war's 5th year, the once invincible armies were cracking. The invaders who had thundered across borders now stumbled back through the same roads they had burned. Their uniforms were torn, their eyes hollow. The empire they'd built on fear was collapsing, inch by inch. Under the weight of their own crimes in the villages they once ruled, the silence began to shift. People stepped out from the shadows, timid at first, then with a growing strength. The same hands that had hidden in cellars now carried rifles scavenged from abandoned battlefields. The resistance, once whispered, now roared in the forests and fields at night. Gunfire echoed from the hills, not from soldiers enforcing terror, but from villagers fighting back. Roads once patrolled by invaders became traps. Bridges were sabotaged, supply lines cut. The hunters had become the hunted. Those who had led the massacres began to feel the ground crumble beneath them. Reports filtered through military channels. Entire units missing. Officers captured. Partisan activity increasing. What had once been dismissed as minor uprisings now tore through the occupying forces like fire through dry grass. The commanders tried to reassert control, but their words carried no power anymore. Their troops were exhausted, frightened, disillusioned. Many soldiers began surrendering quietly, some to save themselves, others out of guilt for what they'd done. The iron discipline that had ruled through fear was gone in one town. The people who had survived the massacres took back their streets. They dragged the invaders' banners from the town hall and raised their own flag, tattered but still standing. When a group of retreating soldiers passed through days later, they were met not with fear, but with gunfire from windows and rooftops. The spirit that had been crushed now burned brighter than ever. As Allied forces advanced, they began uncovering what had been hidden. Behind every retreating unit lay a trail of destruction. Burned farms, emptied villages, fields sown with the remains of the innocent. The photographs and testimonies that surfaced were passed from soldier to soldier. Hardened men who had seen the worst of war wept at the sight of what had been done. The invaders. Leaders tried to destroy the evidence as they fled. Orders were sent to burn documents, demolish prisons, erase every trace of what had happened. But they were too late. The truth had already taken root in witnesses, in surviving papers, in the haunted ruins themselves. Among the captured officers were the very men whose signatures had sealed the fate of countless civilians. They had written the orders with steady hands, never imagining those same papers would one day condemn them. When the first of them were caught, they were no longer the proud figures from propaganda photographs. They were hollow, unshaven, trembling, men stripped of rank and certainty. The world they'd ruled through terror was gone, and the people they'd once called subjects now called them criminals. Some tried to disguise themselves as refugees, blending into columns of the displaced. Others fled into forests, hoping to reach neutral territory. But justice moved faster than they expected. In village after village, survivors recognized faces. A man who had once barked orders in the square was seen trying to trade his metal for bread. Another, who had commanded firing squads, was found hiding in a barn, wearing civilian clothes. The arrests came not with vengeance, but with grim silence. Soldiers led them away in ropes or chains, sometimes through the same streets where their victims had once marched to their deaths. People didn't shout or throw stones. They simply watched. For many, that was enough. When they passed us, one survivor recalled, we didn't cheer, we didn't curse. We just looked at them, and they couldn't look back. News spread quickly. From one town to the next, names of captured war criminals circulated like sparks. Each name carried weight, a reminder that even in chaos, the world had not forgotten justice. By the time the Allied forces declared victory, the hunt had only begun. Lists were drawn, photographs compared, witnesses interviewed. The evidence collected was overwhelming. Written orders, confessions from soldiers, the physical remains of atrocities. In the coming months, special tribunals were established to try those responsible. Some called it revenge, but those who had suffered knew it was something deeper, a reckoning written not in anger, but in memory. As the captured officers were transported to holding camps, survivors came forward with stories long kept silent. The testimonies piled higher than the mountains of burned files. One by one, a veil was lifted from the faces of men who had believed history would forget them. Now, the same world they had terrorized was turning its full gaze upon them. Cameras, journalists, investigators, all recording what would become one of the greatest reckonings in human history. It was no longer about armies or nations. It was about the moral weight of what had been done and what the world would do about it. The invaders' final chapter was no longer written by their own hands. It was written by the survivors, by the soldiers who captured them, and by the courts that would soon pronounce judgment. Justice had begun its slow, deliberate march, and there would be no escape. The day of reckoning arrived not with cheers, but with the slow shuffle of boots and the murmur of restless crowds. The war was over, but the wounds were not. In cities across the liberated world, courtrooms were prepared for a kind of justice the world had never seen before. Wooden benches were filled with survivors, soldiers, journalists, and judges from nations united not by borders, but by grief. The accused were brought in under heavy guard, men who once commanded armies and spread terror across towns now stood small, gray, and silent. Their medals had been stripped, their uniforms replaced with plain jackets. Some avoided eye contact. Others stared ahead, trying to look defiant. Though their hands trembled when the charges were read aloud, the indictments were long, pages upon pages listing every village destroyed, every civilian murdered, every child executed in reprisal. For the first time, their crimes were spoken in open court, recorded not as rumors or propaganda, but as truth. The judges were deliberate, their words steady. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. The weight of the evidence spoke for itself. Witnesses were called, the living proof of what these men had done. A woman stepped forward first. She was small, wrapped in a dark shawl, her voice barely above a whisper. She told the story of her family, her husband shot in front of her, her home burned while she still held her baby in her arms. The courtroom was silent as she spoke. One of the accused shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, eyes fixed on the floor. Then came a priest who had survived by hiding beneath the bodies of the dead in his village square. His testimony was calm, almost too calm. He recited the names of those killed as if reading from Scripture, name after name, each one striking the room like a hammer. When he finished, there were tears even in the eyes of soldiers who had seen the worst of war. The defense tried to claim obedience, that they were only following orders. That war makes monsters of all men. But the prosecutors were relentless. They brought forward documents with signatures, letters written by the same officers now denying involvement. There were photos too, grim, undeniable proof of what had been done. Each image froze the courtroom in silence. Villages turned to ashes. Children lined against walls. Civilians hanging from trees. One by one, the defendants were forced to face the evidence of their own making. Some remained cold, unflinching. Others broke down, not in remorse, but in fear. One officer, once known for his cruelty, screamed when the testimonies mentioned his name. Another fainted as his own written orders were read aloud. "You thought no one would remember," the prosecutor said. "But the earth remembers. The rivers remember. And every survivor sitting in this room remembers." Days turned into weeks. The trials stretched on, gathering story after story, document after document. What emerged was not just a record of war crimes, but a mirror of human cruelty and of endurance. In one of the most haunting moments, a survivor brought forward a photograph taken secretly by the invaders themselves, a group of soldiers smiling beside a burning home. When asked if he recognized anyone, one of the accused hesitated. Then, the prosecutor held the photo up beside him. The match was perfect. The man looked down, his hands covering his face, as the room fell silent. Outside the courthouses, people gathered in the cold. They stood for hours, waiting for news, clutching old photographs of loved ones who had never returned. When verdicts were announced, they didn't cheer. There was no celebration in justice that came too late, only relief that the truth had finally been spoken. Some defendants still refused to accept guilt, clinging to the last fragments of pride. "We were soldiers," one insisted. "We did our duty." But another, older man, rose before the court on the final day and said quietly, "We were not soldiers. We were executioners. And now we stand before our own." The judge's final words were simple and final. For the murders of unarmed civilians, for the burning of towns, for the slaughter of innocents, this court finds you guilty. The sentences varied, imprisonment for some, death for others. But all of them were branded with history's mark, or criminal dot, as the condemned were led from the courtroom. A single sound followed them, the shuffle of chains and the echo of boots on stone. It was the same rhythm they once brought to the villages they destroyed. But this time, they marched toward their own reckoning. For the survivors, watching justice unfold was not joy. It was closure. Many wept silently. Others sat still, eyes fixed on the men who had haunted their nightmares for years. One elderly man said as he left the courtroom, "We did not win today. We simply ended what they began." The trials were not only about punishment, they were about memory. They told the world that no one, no matter how powerful, could hide behind the excuse of obedience. They set a precedent that echoed across generations, that humanity must remember. Even when it hurts to do so. By the time the trials concluded, hundreds had been convicted, and the names of towns once forgotten were carved into history books. The photos, testimonies, and verdicts would go on to teach future generations not about vengeance, but about responsibility, about the price of silence. When the final gavel struck, the room stayed quiet for several long seconds. The sound of it was not victory. It was truth. The condemned were taken away. The survivors returned to what remained of their homes. And the world, scarred but wiser, turned its eyes toward the next chapter, the one where justice would no longer be spoken, but carried out. The morning of the execution came quietly, no fanfare, no crowds, only the low hum of wind across the prison yard. Dawn had barely broken when the guards moved through the corridors, their boots echoing on cold stone floors. Behind the heavy iron doors, the condemned men waited in silence. The same men who had once commanded fear now sat pale and trembling, their eyes hollow, their voices gone. Outside, the world was still. A thin fog hung over the yard, clinging to the gallows like a ghost that refused to leave. The air was sharp, carrying the faint scent of rain and smoke from distant chimneys. For the first time in years, justice stood waiting, calm, patient, and unflinching. The officers in charge had no joy in their duty. They were soldiers too, but this was different. There was no glory in what they were about to do, only necessity. Each man who stood guard that morning knew he was part of something larger, something that would echo long after they were gone. At 6 o'clock sharp, the heavy doors creaked open. The prisoners were led out one by one. Chains rattled against stone. Their steps were slow, almost dragging, as if they were walking through the weight of their own past. Some tried to hold themselves upright, to look proud. Others couldn't. Their faces showed the years of denial, the sudden realization that no army, no ideology, no excuse could save them now. The first man approached the gallows. He looked up at the wooden beam above him, the same kind of beam where, years ago, he had ordered others to be hanged. For a moment, His lips moved, whispering something only he could hear. A prayer, perhaps, or a memory. The guards stood ready. The witnesses, soldiers, judges, and a few survivors watched in grim silence. There was no applause, no shouts of anger. Just the steady rustle of the wind through the trees and the soft creak of the rope. When the lever fell, time seemed to stop. It was over in seconds, but the silence that followed lasted far longer. Another was brought forward, then another. Each time, the same ritual, name read, sentence confirmed, silence, then the final drop. By the third man, even the guards looked pale. This was not vengeance. It was a reminder, a moment meant to balance a scale that had long been broken. One of the condemned, an officer who had once led massacres in the countryside, refused the blindfold. He stared straight ahead and said, voice cracking, "You think this will end it? You think this will erase what happened?" The officer beside him, an American veteran with a face carved by years of war, simply replied, "No, but it will make sure it never happens again." The rope tightened. The platform fell. Justice did its work. When it was over, the gallows stood empty under the gray sky. The fog lifted slowly, revealing the outlines of the nearby fields, the same kind of fields where innocent people had once fallen. The guards removed their hats. The priest who had testified at the trial stepped forward and said a quiet prayer for all souls, both the murdered and the condemned. There was no celebration. No one smiled. Only a deep, heavy stillness, the kind that comes after a storm finally ends. One of the survivors, an elderly woman wrapped in a worn shawl, had been allowed to witness the execution. She didn't speak until it was over. When asked what she felt, she said softly, "It's not revenge I feel. It's peace. They can't hurt anyone anymore." As the bodies were taken away, the guards began dismantling the gallows. Piece by piece, the wood came down, a silent promise that it would never need to stand again. In the days that followed, the story spread across newspapers and radios around the world. Headlines spoke of justice delivered, but the tone was sober, reflective. For many, it was a grim closure, a reminder of what happens when hatred goes unchecked, and of the cost paid to restore humanity. The trials and executions were recorded, documented, archived, not for vengeance, but for memory. Generations later, the black and white photographs still survive. Stern faces, ropes, and soldiers standing at attention under a dim morning sky. For historians, these images became evidence. For survivors, they became a warning. Because justice, as they learned, isn't just about punishment. It's about remembering, about ensuring that the cries of the innocent never fade into silence. In one of the final official statements from that day, the presiding officer wrote, "This is not an act of revenge. It is the closing of a wound that history must not allow to reopen." The world moved on, slowly, painfully, but forward. Towns were rebuilt. Graves were marked. And for those who lived through it, the memory of that morning, the fog, the quiet, the sound of boots on gravel remained etched in their hearts. It was not a story of triumph, but of justice. Not a tale of victory, but of remembrance. And as the sun finally broke through the clouds, it cast light across the prison yard, across the place where darkness had once ruled, now silent and still. The world after the executions felt different, quieter, but not at peace. The air carried a kind of heaviness that words couldn't lift. Across villages and towns once scarred by invasion, people began the slow, painful process of rebuilding not just their homes, but their sense of humanity. For those who had witnessed the trials and the hangings, the memories lingered like ghosts. The sound of the gavel, the creak of the rope, the sight of those who had caused so much pain meeting their end, it all replayed in their minds long after the gallows were gone. Some found comfort in it. Others, only sadness. In a small rural church, candles were lit each night for the victims, not just the dead, but the lost, the broken, the forgotten. Survivors gathered quietly, some praying, others simply sitting in silence. They didn't speak of vengeance. They spoke of endurance, of the will to live on, despite everything that had been taken from them. An old priest who had testified at the trials wrote in his journal, "Justice is not a cure for grief. It is a fence built around memory, a way to keep the darkness from coming back." Those words spread, copied in newspapers, quoted in radio broadcasts, read aloud at memorials. They became a kind of truth for a generation that had seen too much death. In the years that followed, people tried to move forward. Farmers tilled the same soil where villages once burned. Children played in open fields that had been battlegrounds. Mothers planted flowers beside graves that stretched for miles. Life, somehow, found its way back, but the shadow of what had happened never truly disappeared. Many survivors spoke of seeing the faces of their loved ones in dreams, not angry, but watchful, as if reminding them not to forget. The soldiers who had stood guard during the executions carried their own burdens. Some wrote letters home, describing the moment justice was done, and how it didn't feel like victory, only the closing of a terrible chapter. Others stayed silent for the rest of their lives, unable to find the right words for what they had seen. One veteran, decades later, recalled in an interview, "It wasn't about hate. When I saw those men fall, I didn't feel triumph. I felt sorrow. But I also felt something else, relief. Like the world had finally taken a deep breath after holding it for years." The photographs from the trials and executions are locked away for decades. Historians would later uncover them. Black and white images showing stern faces, weary eyes, the grim machinery of justice. They became lessons, reminders to future generations that evil can wear a uniform, that cruelty can hide behind orders, and that silence can be the worst kind of weapon. In the old city squares, monuments were raised. Not grand ones, just simple stones with names etched into them. The names of the innocent, the names of those who were never found. Children would place flowers there every spring, not always knowing the full story, but feeling its weight through the sorrow in their parents' eyes. And in time, even those who had once felt hatred began to see something larger. They began to understand that justice had never been about revenge. It was about remembering the value of life. It was about ensuring that those who suffered would not fade into the background of history. "We rebuilt not with hatred," one survivor said at a memorial decades later, "but with memory, because forgetting would mean it could happen again." The world had learned a brutal lesson. The trials set a precedent that no flag, no army, no order could protect those who committed crimes against humanity. For the first time, nations agreed that there were lines that must never be crossed again, and though new wars would come, though history would stumble and repeat itself in ways big and small, the memory of those days, the courts, the gallows, the silence afterward, stood as a warning carved in time. Back in the quiet countryside, where the first massacres had taken place, the land slowly healed. Trees grew where ruins had once been. Grass covered the scars. Birds returned to the fields. Nature, in its own way, forgave what humanity could not. Every year, on the same morning the executions were carried out, a small group of people gathered near the site of the old prison. They brought flowers and stood in silence. There were no speeches, no cameras, just remembrance. One of them, an old man who had been a child during the war, placed a single white rose beneath a small plaque that read, "For the innocent, may justice forever speak their names." He stayed there a while, eyes fixed on the horizon, before turning back toward the road that led home. The past, he knew, would always follow, but so would the memory of what it had taught him. that peace is not something given, but earned through truth, through courage, and through the refusal to forget. And as the sun dipped below the fields, the world grew quiet again, not in grief this time, but in solemn understanding. Justice had been done, memory preserved, and from the ashes of cruelty, humanity had learned once more to be human.